Paul.
Hi, Jacqui. How are you today?
I'm very well, Paul, thanks. I'm sitting here in my home in Bathurst where it's blowing a gale outside. So today we're doing our call to account session on Zoom for the first time. So let's see how that works. We're going to talk about something that I think is a bit of a hot topic, but there are no hard and fast answers. So we're kind of shooting the breeze with our thoughts on this.
Correct. Yes, that's right.
What this is that for many years now, courts across the globe have been awarding damages in class actions stemming from data breaches, hacks, or theft. However, the judgments that come out rarely explain the approach adopted for calculating the damage, which is essentially a fine generally. And as forensic accountants and valuers, this is really frustrating because when we do our valuation or economic loss reports, we have to set out the mechanics and the rationale underpinning our approach to calculation of value or damage.
Spot on.
And because we're hearing more and more often about the Facebooks and Googles of this world who use our data inappropriately, not to mention the increasing incidence of cybercrime, what we're going to do today is step outside of our comfortable little forensic bubble and have a look at how privacy might be valued. Privacy. I know you say privacy, I say privacy. But by that, I mean the personal identifying information, otherwise known as PII, that we often willingly and often also unknowingly share online or has been lost, stolen, or misused in a data breach, Paul.
Correct. And that's a great introduction, Jacqui. Thank you very much. I thought before we jump in, it'd be quite important to acknowledge that today's discussion examines privacy only in the context of how our personal information is used by enterprises that are in the business of buying and selling data. So as you said, think your Googles and your Facebooks. What we won't touch on today, but what we will come back to in a later episode, are some of the valuation and governance issues associated with breaches of commercially sensitive data. So before we jump in, as I said, we'll talk about the data chain. And if you just let me just share my screen for a moment. So this is the data value chain. There are three different levels. First of all, we have the individual data level. This is made up of all our personal information ranked into different tiers, which reflect the ease or the accessibility of the certain data and the value of certain data that we generate. At the middle, we have the people who create the data marketplace. These are your ad tech firms, such as your Googles and your Facebooks. And then you have the market participants. These might be the organizations who actually go and buy that data to use in product development, for an example.
In terms of the pricing of data, it works along the same lines as as that screen that you shared, Paul, whereby the lowest tier, the more generic, the more past the information, then the lower the value. And vice versa, greater value will be attributed to the increased data granularity about the person themselves. So moving up into the higher tiers, as this will improve the ability of the buyer of that data to pinpoint and more cleverly target the consumer. So while we're still on the topic of pricing of data, I'd like you, Paul, to share another screen, if you wouldn't mind, to show some interesting research which sets out the value or price placed on the different tiers of personal data based on a survey of a random 2,200 people surveyed in America. The generic stuff, your name, your email address, your mailing address, which we all have to give every time we, get into another website where we want to buy something. We know everyone's going to get that stuff. So it's kind of priced in people's minds at a low rate, $50 US in this case. Moving up the scale to the higher rated, if you like, data on those higher tiers, up to sort of $1,000. I'm not sure I would sell my passport number.
No, so I think it's a bit of a flaw in that, but it's fairly indicative of what prices that people would be selling to at least the lower level data.
Or to setting a little bit of context on the scale of data theft,
misuse
and breach that we've researched just for the recent times. So last year, an estimated 300 million people were at risk of identity theft and fraud as a result of misuse of data. And in just the short time that we've had this year already, there have been some real doozies, including in January, a Chinese social media management company suffered a data leak which exposed account details and PII of at least 214 million social media users from Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Wow. In April, the personal data of 533 million Facebook users from 106 countries was posted online for free in a low-level hacking forum. I mean, wow. Also in April, over 500 million LinkedIn user profiles were discovered on the dark web. What is the dark web? I don't even know how to find that, but let's not even try because it might get you into trouble. Anyway, those hackers shared 2 million of those 500 million of these LinkedIn records for the princely sum of $2, merely to prove the legitimacy of the information that they had stolen. And of course, the range of the PII disclosed in these breaches or hacks were the full gamut: passwords, usernames, people's photographs, profile descriptions, followers, and engagement logistics. I mean, the mind boggles. It's just a treasure trove of data about you and me and the building blocks for identity theft and fraud.
That's right. So you've given about the scale. Let's just quickly touch on the cost of the data breaches. So in 2021, it's the forecast global cost of data breaches is to be approximately $6 trillion. That's a 100% increase on 2015, or for the mathematically inclined, an annual growth rate of 12%. Now, who wouldn't want an annual growth rate of 12%? Yahoo, when it was being bought by Verizon, had $300 million wiped off its price due to a breach of 3 billion accounts, and that equates to about 30 cents per user. And when Sony PlayStation's network was breached in April 2021, resulting in that data breach of 77 million subscribers, just over a 24-hour period, Sony incurred some 128 million euros in direct costs associated with remediating those breaches. That's quite a sum.
It is absolutely astronomical. But of course, there's the indirect costs of data theft and breaches as well that we don't necessarily think about or try to quantify. So the types of indirect costs that I'm talking about are costs to repair the breach, to investigate the cause of it, and the massive marketing and media spend to limit reputational damage to the company who has been breached. Many of those costs are often overlooked in the final tally of the total cost of that breach. So
I guess now is the time, and this is probably the where we want to focus today, is how would we value privacy? Now, typically as valuers, and I'll defer to you because you're the expert valuer here, and when we value assets or intangibles such as the right to exploit a patent, it's generally quite clear what object is being valued. But privacy, I mean, it certainly doesn't meet the accounting definition of an asset. And while some jurisdictions around the globe might recognise the right to privacy, Australia does not. So even should a defendant be found guilty of breaching privacy, the key stumbling block to awarding damages is that the plaintiff has not actually suffered any financial loss. And in this regard, Australia is not unique. And that is exactly the question the UK Supreme Court is currently considering or determining in the case of Lloyd versus Google, which was a massive claim that was brought in 2019. So for the moment, our discussion on valuing our personal information, our privacy in a litigation context remains largely conceptual. Although, when saying that, I mean, then there may be avenues where it is entirely relevant, such as, for example, the misleading, deceptive conduct that's currently being brought by ASC against Google, and where the courts may need, I guess, some sort of context or reasonable basis for determining the fine for actually misusing the data. And, that's where we are now. But I think, given where we are moving with cybersecurity breaches, it may also become, this conceptual framework may also become useful should the courts be facing large class actions in cybersecurity breaches, or in claims where there have been, for example, the improper uses of cookies. But if we're going to devalue privacy, we're going to need to have an overall approach to guide us. One that will get us around that stumbling block where the victim who's suffered the data breach has not really suffered any financial loss. Now, I know my suggestion might be a little controversial because it doesn't actually sit well with legal principle. But given that we're talking conceptually, I think it's appropriate to maybe flip the perspective of loss from what the victim has lost to actually the enrichment obtained by the defendant company who has not been consistent or secure in the way it deals with and monetizes our personal information. So now I'm going to hand over to you, Jacqui, and actually we'll talk through some of those valuation approaches that might be relevant. Let me just share my screen.
Yes, thanks, Paul. The first generally accepted valuation principle that might be able to be utilized in this example, or in this context, I should say, is a discounted cash flow approach based on the revenue or the profit per record or user per month. Now, that seems relatively straightforward. It can be quantified using disclosed financial information that shouldn't be that hard to get hold of. For example, Facebook's $27 billion in revenue in 2016 equates to approximately $20 per month per active user per year, although that could be up to 4 times greater in more developed countries. So you have to think about that as well.
Yeah.
Maybe this approach would be considered a stable, reliable sort of a measure. And indeed, it may be thought to reflect a market-based measurement which intersects between the supply and demand for a particular record.
Yeah.
Relatively easy to identify and can be aggregated. But it has some weaknesses, Paul.
I think it does. And I think, when we're looking at, say, the economic value of data, well, some of these weaknesses we're going to talk about actually will be consistent across a number of the approaches. So the moment you actually take a flat revenue or another number and divide it by users, you're actually assuming one flat cost per record. And if you recall from the very top of the episode, we talked about how different tiers of personal information will have different value. And this kind of just all bundles it all together and assumes it's one flat cost per record. So I don't think this is probably one of the key weaknesses, as is the fact that what this does is only look at the economic value of the data from the perspective of who it was. So from Google, what it doesn't do is take into account what we might refer to as the multiplier effect, the value that's actually created by other businesses that are then buying that and using that data to generate even more economic value.
And on a similar vein, still a generally accepted approach might be, again, a discounted cash flow approach, but this time based on the market's selling price of that data. As we know, there are companies out there that actually sell data at a number. And of course, the strength of that is that you can actually quantify that by reference to proprietary information, assuming you can actually get it.
That's right.
It's always a bit tricky, particularly in Australia.
And I like this. This gets around the flat cost per record. But what it doesn't do is it would only look at the price of that data from a single transaction perspective. And again, it suffers from that same sort of flaw in that it doesn't capture the full multiplier effect of the economic value added.
So the third one we've got here is a market valuation approach, such as a market cap, a listed company market cap per record. Now, the strength of that it would be relatively simple to calculate and can be quantified by reference to listed market information. For example, the valuation of a tech company, the market cap, is directly linked to the underlying value of its user data. That makes sense. So for an example here, Microsoft, when it acquired LinkedIn for $26.2 billion in cash, at the time, LinkedIn had 400 million users. So going with that market cap information, the single user data point was valued at $65 per user in that purchase. Similarly, but a slightly different result, when Facebook acquired WhatsApp for 19.6 billion, what Facebook was doing was paying $39.6 for each of WhatsApp's 500 million users. So that's what we mean when we talk about the market approach. But again, Paul, that's got weaknesses.
It certainly does. I mean, because the market is going to be subject to other fluctuations that might be going on, you're not going to get you're not going to be able to, comfortably say that transaction is, any movements are solely related to that transaction. So, I guess it's indicative, but it will be blurred. And of course, it suffers from the other weaknesses that we've just discussed a moment ago on the other approaches.
What are the other approaches we could take?
I guess there are other approaches that don't actually look at the economic value of data. And I think this comes back to some of the testing that you spoke about earlier in what prices people might buy and sell. So it's a very similar sort of approach. So if you look at how much is the cost to protect data, what someone is prepared to sell us a package to protect data doesn't actually reflect how much I would pay to protect my data, or doesn't reflect how much I would actually prepare to sell my data. And then the other one is, and what we talked about at the very end of the last section, was the total cost of the breach. Now, they'll be the direct costs the company incurred, plus the indirect costs. But then again, it may not be able to include the full range of indirect costs, such as reputational damage. And of course, it doesn't really give a value per user. Again, these are, if we're talking about it from the perspective, a court having some sort of framework to estimate a fine, these are some great indicators to do so.
And before we move on, I just want to alert everybody that there is proposed legislation in the US at the moment referred to as the Dashboard Act, which is it's actually trying to have some legislation built to ensure that companies with more than 100 million users would have to disclose in their financial statements an assessment of the financial value of their data, as well as reveal the revenue generated by all of that data. But the legislation doesn't include how they would value that. So this is still very much a work in progress and will be something that we'll see more and more of.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the question is now, taking these into account, what might be an approach that might get around some of these? And I'd like to think about this as what we might call an incremental approach to valuing data.
Exactly. Yeah, incremental.
So we've already got the basis, whether that could be revenue per record, per the market selling price. We could be looking at the cost per cost of breach, per user. All that sort of stuff might actually give us the actual base cost, and on top of that, we might actually start looking at how much would a business, let's say Procter & Gamble, actually save in terms of being able to move to market earlier, in terms of its product testing, in terms of its online marketing, by using that data to actually save some costs. So now we're actually now beginning to capture the market value of that data on top of the base data.
Exactly, Paul. So in summary, our view is very much that the appropriate way to value privacy is, and the language we're going to use is an incremental approach to measure the bundled value of the data sold. What we mean by the bundled value is starting off with something that could be the market selling price of the data collected by somebody, plus the additional value gained by augmenting their profile through the use of cookies and everyone finding out stuff about us that we didn't give them, plus any additional value obtained by the beneficiary of that bundled data. So as Paul said, what we mean by that additional value is that multiplier effect. It's what the Procter and Gambles of this world, how much they increase their revenue by the fact that they know so much more about us,
or reduce their costs. So we'll call that a day.
We'll call it a day.
But what we will be doing is returning in our next episode and we'll have a special guest on who'll be talking about the some of the valuation and governance issues associated with breaches of commercially sensitive information.
Sensitive.
So that's just cybersecurity, client information, and the like. So until then, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much. Bye.